Namaskar. We will now move further with module 5, and as we have already seen, module 5 comprises 4 sessions where we have completed 2 sessions and we have spoken about the models of consumers. We have also spoken about the models of consumer behavior, where we have spoken about the general models of buying. Then we have also discussed the basic models in terms of the business to consumer markets and business to business markets. And then moving forth, we are to discuss the models of consumer behavior, where we will be speaking about certain specific models. I have divided this topic on specific models into 2 sessions. So, we will be referring to this as part 1 and part 2. These models of consumer behavior which form the specific models which we will discuss today form the R3 of this 4-part module, 4-hour module. And in the specific models, we will be speaking about 2 specific models. As we all know, consumer models refer to varying orientations and perspectives with which consumers approach the marketplace, and we see how the varying orientations impact the buying decision process and the overall buyer behavior. This particular session will deal with 2 specific models, where we will talk about the Howard and Shate model and the Nicosia model. The next session will talk about 2 other specific models, where we will be speaking about the Engel, Collett and Blackwell model, which was later modified as the Engel, Collett and Miniard model, and then we will also be speaking about the Bettman's information processing model. Now, let us start with the Nicosia's model today. Nicosia proposed his model in 1966. This particular model was proposed by Francesco Nicosia. He was the first to explain about the complex decision process that consumers engage in while buying process or while deciding to buy goods and services. Instead of following a very traditional approach or a very conservative approach of laying a focus on the physical activity or on the act of purchase, Nicosia basically spoke about the dynamics involved in the consumer decision process, and he explained his model in the form of a flow chart illustrating the various decision steps, decision making steps through which consumers pass before they adopt or before they buy goods and services. So, this is the model which we will be speaking about and laying focus on. This was proposed by Nicosia, and the various components of the model are seen as very interactive, where they interact with each other, with none being essentially dependent or independent. None of these is essentially dependent or independent. They are all connected through direct loops as well as feedback loops. The model basically describes the flow of influences where each component actually acts as an input to the next component, and the consumer decision making process focuses on the relationship between the marketing organization and its consumers. The marketing organization, through its marketing program or through its 4 Ps, affects the consumers. The customers, through their response to the marketer's action, affects the subsequent decisions of the marketer, and the cycle continues. So, we see on the one hand it is the marketer who through his program affects the consumers, and the consumers with their response affects the marketer's subsequent action, and the process goes on. The various components of the model are further distinguished into main fields and subfields, and the main fields and the subfields of the model are the marketer's communication affecting consumer attitude, the consumer's search for information, the purchase action, the consumption purchase experience, and the feedback. So, we have these fields and subfields. The first field starts from the marketer or the source of message to the consumer and his attitude. The second starts from the search for information to the evaluation of means or ends relations, which forms the pre-action field, and the third field basically actually relates to the act of purchase, and the fourth field relates to the feedback. So, if we see we have 4 fields where the field 1 speaks about the source of message to the consumer from the marketer to the consumer's attitude. Field 2 speaks about search for and evaluation of means ends relations, which forms the pre-action field. Field 3 is the act of purchase, and field 4 is the feedback. This is further divided into some subfields, where we have subfield 1 in the form of firm's attributes, put in at formulated in the form of a message exposed to the consumer and affecting consumers' attitude. So, the model basically represents a 4 field model, where the first 3 fields represent the various decision making steps that consumers follow during the purchase decision process. Field 1 is the first field, ranges from the source of the message or the marketer to the consumer's attitude. It basically comprises the firm's attributes that are communicated and affect the consumer's psychological attributes. The field basically explains the attitude formation based on the message exposure. In field 2, we see it ranges from the search of information to the evaluation of means or ends relations. This also forms the pre-action field. It comprises the consumer's search for information about the firm's product and its evaluation compared to the different alternatives which are available. Then we have field 3, where it is the actual act of purchase. It basically comprises the consumer's motivated state of mind to enter into a purchase transaction. The fourth field acts as a feedback. It basically comprises the storage, the usage and resultant experience with respect to the product, which acts as a feedback mechanism. Now, we will discuss each of these fields and subfields in a little elaborate manner. Let us start with field 1. Now, field 1 is marketers' communication affecting the consumer's attitude. So, this is actually the communication from the source of the message to the consumer's attitude. So, the source of the message is the marketer, and it is meant to basically have an impact on the consumer's attitude. The consumer is exposed to the firm's attributes through the marketing communication, both personally and impersonally. This information could relate to the firm's attributes as well as the product, the price, the distribution. The message which is transmitted to the consumer affects his perception, predisposition and attitude towards the firm and its offering. The impact on perception and attitude is also dependent upon consumer's personal characteristics like his values, his experiences, the culture, the subculture, the social influences and the like. Thus, through field 1, the marketer's communication affects the consumer's attitude. Then we have field 2, where we speak about the consumer's search for information and evaluation. Basically, the consumer's search for an evaluation of the means or ends relations, which forms the pre-action field. So, after the attitude is formed, the consumer moves to field 2 of the model. The consumer searches for information about the product category, about the varying alternatives, and thereafter evaluates the various brands on criteria like attributes, benefits, features, etc. These criteria could be based on his learning and past experiences as well as the marketer's inputs, and this step basically creates a motive in the mind of the consumer to purchase a product. This leads to field 3, which is the purchase action or the act of purchase. Now, the decision making on the part of the model and the act of purchase is actually what comprises this stage. The motivated state to purchase leads to field 3 of the model. Consumer finally gets into action and buys the product from a retailer. This leads to field 4, which is consumption experience and feedback. The purchase action on the part of the consumer leads to field 4 of the model, which is his experience and feedback. The consumption experience and feedback has an impact and acts as a feedback in the next stage. After purchasing the product and the related consumption of the product, the consumer may basically have two kinds of experiences. A positive experience in terms of the customer satisfaction. It would reinforce his predisposition with the product or the brand and make him loyal towards it. On the other hand, there may be a negative experience which implies consumers' dissatisfaction, which would affect his attitude negatively, lower down his evaluation about the product and or brand, and even block his future purchases. This field provides feedback to the marketer, who can also take it as inputs to modify his marketing mix accordingly. So, in the first field, if we see, the marketer communicates with the customer and promotes a product which is unfamiliar to him. He speaks about the various attributes, he speaks about the firm's attributes as also about the product, about the price, about the place, and he basically tries to promote an unfamiliar product to the customer. Depending upon the existing predispositions and his evaluation, the consumer develops his attitude. So, this is through a message exposure, the firm's attributes, the product, price, place and promotion is going to have an impact upon development of the consumer's attitude. Okay. This is going to lead to stage 2, where the consumer searches for information and evaluates the information on various criteria. He evaluates the different brands or the different alternatives on various criteria, and finally develops a motivation to act. A motivation to act here means to buy or not to buy, and if to buy, what to buy. So, he basically develops an attitude, or he develops a positive attitude towards an intention to buy and to the act of purchase. So, it leads to a motivated state of mind and moves to stage 3. In stage 3, there is the action or the final purchase decision. The consumer buys the product, he buys a particular alternative and or brand from a chosen retailer and gets back, and there is basically post purchase, there is consumption and feedback, which leads to field 4. Now, he experiences product usage, and based on product usage he forms a positive or a negative attitude towards the product and or brand, and this is going to have an impact on subsequent purchases. This should also be taken as inputs by a marketer to modify the marketing mix. So, basically in field 4, the consumer experience would act as be stored in his memory. These experiences will be stored in his memory for further reference, for further retrieval, for further usage, and subsequent actions on the part of the consumer in the form of satisfaction and dissatisfaction and repeat purchase will actually give an input to the marketer whether he should be going in for modifying his marketing mix and how he should go about it. So, here we see this entire model where through the firm communicates with the consumers through its messages, and basically consumer reacts through an act of purchase. So, both the firm and the consumer influence each other. This particular model, as we said before, explains the dynamics involved in the decision making process and very clearly illustrates the processes which consumers use towards when they buy goods and services. The consumer's action, the marketer's action and consumer's action influence each other. The decision process focuses on the relationship between the marketing organization and the consumer. Marketing organization through his 4 P's affects the customer, and customer through his response basically affects marketer's reaction and marketer's decisions in the future. So, the cycle basically continues. Now, let us actually discuss the assessment of the model. The model is something which is very integrative in nature. It tries to integrate the body of knowledge that existed at the time of formulation of the various models in the in the area of consumer behavior. It is a very pioneering attempt where appreciation lies in the form of Nicosia's approach to describe the consumer decision making process through a flow chart. He was the first person to basically describe consumer decision making and the various steps leading to consumer purchase through a flow chart, and also basically broke down the various components and subcomponents of the flow chart in the form of fields and subfields. So, it was a pioneering attempt on the part of Nicosia, where he laid focus on the conscious decision making process of the consumers, where the act of purchase was just one part, what was just one stage in the entire ongoing decision process of consumers. So, the flow charting approach basically proposed by Nicosia systematizes as well as simplifies the various constructs, the various variables that have an impact on consumer decision making. The flow charting approach, as we said, simplifies and systematizes the variables. It contributes to the step-by-step funnel approach, which views consumers' movement from general product knowledge towards specific brand knowledge, and from passive position to an active state, which is motivated towards a particular brand. So, if we see this, if we assess it, it is a funnel approach where the consumer moves from general product knowledge to specific brand knowledge, and he moves from a passive state of mind to a very active state of mind, highly motivated towards the act of purchase. That is how this particular model has been appreciated and and looked up with a lot of appreciation, and a lot of credit has been given to Nicosia, who has put in all efforts to basically simplify and systematize the entire process and show the relationship between the marketer and his communication strategy vis-a-vis the consumer, and the consumer reaction in the form of a feedback. So, this is how the model has been assessed. However, there are certain limitations with respect to the model. The model basically proposes certain assumptions, boundaries and constraints that are not always realistic. It has also been said that the major variables which he has dealt with in the form of attitude, motivation, experience, perception may not actually occur in the same sequence. Also, the various variables have been left undefined, and the various there is a lot of ambiguity in the manner to which he actually defines these variables. Also, the model fails to take into account other factors internal to the individual which affect consumer decision making. They have not been dealt and defined with completely. And finally, the model has also yet to be tested for its reliability and validity. The mathematical testing of the model and its validity is questionable across product categories and across purchase situations. So, that is the reason why this particular model is regarded as something which is not very realistic and cannot be generalized to major purchase decisions. Now, let us come to the second model which we will talk today, which is the Howard and Shate model, which was proposed in 1969. Now, while the particular model was proposed for industrial buying in the 60s, the term buyer here is used to define both industrial consumers and personal consumers. Howard used the term buyer behavior, and he did not use the word consumer behavior, as he said that industrial buyers and consumers are most similar in most aspects, and the decision making process is not very different either. So, he used the word buying behavior and not consumer behavior. Through the particular model, he tried to explain buying behavior, and he said buyers were very rational, and the process is something which can be looked up with a lot of rationality, where consumers also make decisions in cases of incomplete in case of incomplete information. While Howard and Shate defined the buying process, they differentiated between 3 levels of decision making in terms of EPS, LPS and RPS, in extensive problem solving, limited problem solving and routinized problem solving. We have discussed EPS, LPS and RPS in the earlier sessions. Also, Howard and Shate gave a lot of importance to repeat purchases and repeat buying. So, this particular model can be studied taking into account different scenarios of EPS, LPS and RPS, and through the model Howard and Shate basically focused on the repeat purchase or the repeat buying process. The particular model which has been proposed by Howard and Shate have 4 variables or 4 major components. We have the stimulus inputs or the input variables. We have the hypothetical constructs in the form of perceptual constructs and learning constructs, and we have the response output in the form of output variables. Apart from that, we also have certain variables which are exogenous variables. So, we see that there are 4 major components: the inputs, the hypothetical constructs in the form of perceptual and learning constructs, and the output, and apart from that there are the exogenous variables. Now, speaking about the inputs or speaking about the input variables, we will talk about them as stimulus inputs. They basically refer to the stimuli in the environment. These stimuli in the environment take the form of informative cues about the product or service offering. These information cues could relate to product, the price, the quality, the distinctiveness, the service and the availability. So, the informative cues about the product or service offering could take forms of quality, price, distinctiveness, service and availability. These informative cues which actually comprise the stimulus inputs could be significative, could be symbolic and could be social. So, the informational cues could take 3 forms: a significative, symbolic and social. The significative and symbolic cues are commercial in nature and can be controlled by the marketer. They are under the control of the marketer, who basically represents them in the form of quality, price, distinctiveness, service and availability, and he can maneuver them or through his 4 P's or through his marketing mix. But on the other hand, the social cues are non-commercial in nature and they are not controlled or are uncontrollable by the marketer, and they take the form of stimuli or inputs or in the form of all that is coming from as influences from the family, from the reference group and from the social class. All these 3 type of stimuli provide inputs or provide stimulus inputs concerning the product or brand to the consumer. So, let us first talk about significative, symbolic and social stimuli. The significative stimuli basically is the product or brand information that the marketer provides. It deals essentially with brand characteristics and could manifest itself in the form of quality, price, distinctiveness, service and availability. Then you have the symbolic stimuli, which is the psychological form with which a consumer perceives the product and service offering or the brand. So, it is figurative and perceptual and depends on the how the offer has been positioned, depends upon the ways in which the particular offering has been positioned. It basically emanates from the advertising and promotion efforts from the marketer. So, the symbolic stimuli is basically the psychological form with which a consumer perceives a particular product or service offering, and something that is actually impacted by the advertising and promotion efforts of the marketer, and also by the way in which a particular brand has been positioned by the marketer. Then, as we said earlier, this symbolic stimuli could also take form of quality, price, distinctiveness, service and availability. Both significative and symbolic stimuli are under the control of the marketer and can be influenced by them. On the other hand, then we speak of the social stimuli, which actually comprises the information about the product or service offering that comes from the social environment. The social environment here implies the family, the groups, the society and the culture at large, and this particular social stimuli is something which is outside or remains outside the purview of control from the marketer. It is absolutely uncontrollable by the marketer. So, this is what we mean by the stimulus inputs or the inputs as a construct to the particular model. These are the input variables of the particular model. Then we now move to the hypothetical constructs of the model, which take the form of perceptual constructs and learning constructs. The perceptual constructs relate to obtaining and processing information received from the input variable. So, they basically speak of they relate to the obtaining information and processing information that is received from the stimuli or from the input variable, be it significative, symbolic or social. There are three perceptual constructs, there are four perceptual constructs. We speak about search for information, stimulus ambiguity, attention and perceptual bias. Now, once the buyer is exposed to any information, there is an attention. Okay? This attention towards the stimuli will depend upon the sensitivity to the information from the buyer in terms of his urge and receptivity towards such information. So, once a buyer is exposed to a stimuli, there is an attention on his part which will actually depend upon his sensitivity to information in terms of his urge and receptivity towards such information. Not all information would be processed by the consumer, and the intake of information will actually be subject to perceived uncertainty and lack of meaningful of the information. Stimulus ambiguity will occur when a consumer does not understand the message from the environment. It could trigger off a need for a specific and active search for information, which we will call as the overt search of information. The information that will be gathered and processed by the consumer may also suffer from perceptual bias if the consumer distorts the information received so as to fit it to his or her established needs, values, beliefs, experiences, etc. So, if we look at the perceptual constructs, a consumer is exposed to an information, there is an attention on his part. This attention will depend upon his sensitivity, this attention to the stimuli or attention to the information will depend upon his sensitivity to information in terms of his urge and receptivity towards such information. Not all of the information will be processed in the similar manner. Stimulus ambiguity may occur when he does not understand a message from the environment, or if the stimulus is not very clearly perceived and understandable. This could trigger off an overt search for information, which will be an active and very specific search for information. Finally, the information which is gathered and processed may suffer from perceptual bias, where the consumer may distort it to fit it in to his established needs, values, beliefs, experiences, etc. So, this is what we mean by the perceptual constructs. Then we also have the learning constructs. Talking about the learning constructs, they relate to the consumer learning, his formation of attitudes and opinions, and the final decision making. There are 7 learning constructs. We have motive, we have choice criteria, the brand comprehension, the attitude, the intention, the confidence and the satisfaction. Now, let us discuss these the learning constructs a little more elaborately. Now, the learning constructs range from basically the buyer's motive for a purchase to the final satisfaction of the purchase. It is the interplay of these 7 constructs which ultimately lead to response output or to a purchase. So, basically we start with the buyer's motive to purchase a particular product and or brand, and then finally leading to his ultimate satisfaction from the purchase. The motive here refers to the goals that a buyer seeks to achieve through a purchase and the corresponding urge towards action or the purchase activity. So, motives here talk about the goals that a buyer seeks to achieve through a purchase and the corresponding urge towards action or towards the purchase activity. It is activated state of the mind. Then we have the brand comprehension, which is the knowledge and information that a particular consumer or a buyer has about the various brands in his evoked set. So, it is basically the information and knowledge that he has about the various brands that he is aware of and that form a part of his evoked set. The buyer forms an order of preference for the various brands. This order of preference is based on decision mediators, which we call as choice criteria. The decision maker mediators are the evaluative criteria and the application of decision rules by a buyer to the various purchase alternatives. So, based on the choice criteria, the attitudes are formed for the various brands. The attitudes here reflect basically the predisposition of the buyer, his preference towards alternative brands, and his feelings of like and dislike towards certain offerings. Now, then we have what we call as the confidence level. The brand potential of the evoked set determines the buyer's perception and the confidence or level of the brands that he is considering to buy. The purchase intention will be a cumulative outcome of the interaction of the buyer's motives, the choice criteria, the brand comprehension, the brand attitude, and the confidence associated with the purchase. Satisfaction, which is another construct, involves the post purchase evaluation and the resultant impact, that is whether expectation from an offering has matched the performance and whether the resultant impact is positive or negative with respect to brand comprehension. So, we start with a motive, okay, which is activated state of mind where the buyer seeks to achieve some kind of a satisfaction through a purchase activity. The buyer seeks to fulfill a need through a purchase activity, and this leads to an urge towards action or purchase. There is brand comprehension, which actually reflects his knowledge and information about the various brands in the evoked set. There are various choice criteria or decision mediators which the consumer uses to evaluate the various brands, and he basically applies decision rules to be able to focus on certain purchase alternatives. Based on his choice criteria, attitudes are formed with respect to various brands. These attitudes reflect the predisposition of the buyer and also reflect feelings of like and dislike towards certain product offerings. The evaluation and attitudes and the predisposition basically gives rise to confidence level of the brands with respect to the brands that he is considering to buy. The purchase intention is a cumulative outcome of the various other constructs like motives, choice criteria, brand comprehension, attitude, and confidence associated with a particular alternative. Finally, there is satisfaction, which involves the post purchase evaluation. Either the product has met expectations or has not met expectations, and the resultant impact positive or negative on the brand comprehension. So, this is what actually comprises the various learning constructs. Then we have the response outputs. Okay. So, response output here refers to the consumer's action or response to stimulus inputs. There are 5 constituents arranged in a hierarchy, start from attention and ending up with a purchase. So, we have attention giving rise to brand comprehension, to attitude, to intention, to purchase. So, basically these are the buyer's actions or output variables or a response to the stimulus inputs or the input variables which he was exposed to. Attention is the degree or level of information that a buyer accepts when exposed to. A comprehension is the amount of information that he actually processes and stores. Attitude is a composite of cognition, affect and behavior towards his offering, much manifested in the form of like or dislike for the particular product and or brand. Intention is the consumer's intention to buy or not to buy a particular product offering, and purchase behavior is the actual act of purchase. So, you have these 5 constituents as a part of the response outputs. Howard and Sate also spoke about certain exogenous models where which influence some or all of the constructs explained earlier and thereby impact the final output variables. These have been explained as inhibitors or environmental forces that restrain the purchase of a favored brand. For example, the importance of the purchase, the price, the financial status of the buyer, the time at the disposal of the buyer to make a purchase, the various personality traits, the social pressures, etc. All of these comprise the exogenous model variables which have an impact on the purchase of a favored brand. They act as inhibitors or environmental forces. Now, let us actually speak a little bit about the working relationship between the construct and the model. Now, through the model, Howard and Sate explain buying decision process that the buyer undergoes and the various factors that affect his choice decision towards a particular brand. The process starts with when a buyer is exposed to the stimulus. As a result of the exposure, stimulus ambiguity occurs, which could lead to a word search for information. The information that is received by the consumer or the potential consumer is contingent upon the interplay between the attitudes and his motives. The search for information and the conclusions drawn is also filtered by perceptual bias that would be a result of his attitude, confidence, search for information and motives. Now, this may alter the existing patterns or of motives and choice criteria, thereby leading to a change in the attitude towards the brand comprehension, the motives, the purchase intention or the action. The final purchase decision is based on the interaction between the brand comprehension, the strength of attitude towards the brand, confidence in the purchase decision and the purchase intention. The actual act is influenced by the buyer's intention and inhibitors which he confronts. So, the entire process is impacted by various exogenous variables like the importance of the purchase, price, time available to make the purchase, social and cultural influences, etc. After the purchase, the buyer experiences satisfaction if the performance matches and exceeds expectation. This satisfaction would strengthen brand comprehension, reinforce the confidence associated with the buying situation and strengthen the intention to repeat purchase of the brand. With the satisfying purchase decision, the buyer will learn about buying in similar situations. And in this manner, the behavior will tend to get routinized. That is where Howard and Sate spoke about repeat buying or repetitive purchases. The purchase feedback thus acts as an influence on the consumer's attitude and his attention. Let us now speak about the assessment of the model. The model is highly integrative. It incorporates many of the aspects of consumer behavior and it links together various alternatives or it links together various constructs, various variables which influence the consumer decision making process, and it also explains the various variables which lead to the decision as also their relationships. So, it is not only explanation of these variables or these constructs which lead to the purchase decision, but it also explains the relationship between the various constructs. It talks about the working relationship of these constructs. It highlights the importance of the stimulus inputs to the consumer buying process. The model also speaks about repetitive buying, and it is the first model to basically speak about satisfaction and loyalty and repetitive purchases. So, it basically Howard and Sate were the first to divulge as to what constitutes loyalty for a specific product. It also again helps marketers gain insights into how consumers process information. This processing of information is impacted by the perceptual constructs and the learning constructs, and the perceptual and learning constructs have an impact ultimately on the response output or the act of purchase. A model is very user friendly and it is one of the very few models which has been tested in depth, and so issues of reliability and validity are not in question. It is a model which is very robust and it has been successfully used across many purchase situations and many purchase decisions. This is one of the first few models which talks very elaborately about the role of perception, about learning, and about consumer attitude. It speaks about the marketer's inputs, it speaks about the consumer and his output. So, it speaks about a stimulus response in the form of stimulus coming from the marketer and output being resultant from the consumer. In between, there are the perceptual and the learning constructs, as well as impact of attitudes, etc., which has an impact upon consumer decision making. Howard and Sate were also the first to speak about exogenous variables or the inhibitors, which actually have an impact on the final act of purchase. However, this particular model has been criticized because it has been said that the various while the model has been tested, the various constructs cannot be realistically tested in isolation. So, as a whole, the model could be tested and generalizations could be drawn, but otherwise the constructs are not capable of being realistically tested in isolation. Some of the constructs are not very adequately defined and do not lend themselves to very valid measurements. So, that is the reason why this particular model has been criticized. So, this completes our discussion on the two models, which is Nicosia's model and the Howard and Sate model. In the next session, we will be talking about the Engel, Collat and Blackwell model, or the EKB model, which was proposed in the 80s and then was modified later as the EKM model, or the Engel, Collat and Maynard model. We will also speak about the other model, another model, which is the Bettman's information processing model, in the next session. So, the references for further reading, we have Howard and Sate, 1969, The Theory of Buyer Behavior, John Wiley. Kotler and Armstrong, Principles of Marketing, 11th edition, 2006, Prentice Hall. Kotler and Keller, Marketing Management, 13th edition, 2009, Pearson. Loudon and Bitta, Consumer Behavior, 4th edition, Tata McGraw-Hill, 2002. Nicosia 1976, Consumer Behavior Towards Sociology of Consumption, Journal of Consumer Research. We have Peter and Olson, Consumer Behavior and Marketing Strategy, 7th edition, 2005, McGraw-Hill. We have Schiffman and Kanuk, Consumer Behavior, 3rd edition, Princess Hall. We have Schiffman and Kanuk, Consumer Behavior, 8th edition, Prentice Hall, and Wells and Prensky, Consumer Behavior, John Wiley and Sons, 1996. Okay, now let us come to the frequently asked questions. We have these questions which could be asked. Question 1, briefly explain and assess the Howard and Sate model of consumer behavior, where you basically will be required to speak about the model, the various constructs in the model, the stimulus inputs, the hypothetical constructs in the form of the learning and the perceptual constructs, and then the response outputs, as well as the exogenous variables. You will also be required to explain the working relationship between the model and speak about the assessment of the model and the limitations of the model. This is question 1. Coming to question 2, which is critically assess Nicosia's model of consumer behavior. So, you will talk about the model, you will explain the flow chart approach to the model, the various fields, the various subfields, right from the firm's attributes and consumer attitudes to his motive, to his intention to search for information, to the motives, to his intention to buy, and to the ultimately the feedback and final impact on the marketers' efforts. We also then we will talk about the assessment of the model and the limitations of the model. Then we come to the self-evaluation in terms of some small quiz or a test. Section A is true false. So, the first question is, originally the Howard and Sate model was proposed for industrial buying. So, is it a true statement or a false statement? Well, this is a true statement. Originally the Howard and Sate model was introduced or was proposed for industrial buying. Second question, the flow charting approach proposed by Nicosia complicates the process that affects consumer decision making. So, is it a true statement or is it a false statement? Well, this statement is absolutely false. It does not complicate the process, rather it simplifies the process that affects consumer decision making. Now, I come to fill in the blanks. First question, the Howard-Sate model has 4 components: stimulus inputs, dash, response outputs, and exogenous variables. So, we have stimulus inputs, hypothetical constructs, response outputs, and exogenous variables. So, the answer is hypothetical constructs. We could further break them down into perceptual constructs and learning constructs. Dash, second question, Dash presented his model in the form of a flow chart. So, who presented his model in the form of a flow chart? It was Nicosia who presented his model in the form of a flow chart. So, we talk of Nicosia, who basically is the person who is credited with proposing his model in the form of a flow chart. Come to multiple choice questions. According to Howard and Sate, the response output comprises 5 constituents which could be arranged in a hierarchy. Which of the following is the right hierarchical sequence? A. Attention, comprehension, attitude, intention, and purchase. B. Attention, attitude, comprehension, intention, and purchase. C. Attention, intention, comprehension, attitude, and purchase. Or D. Attention, intention, comprehension, purchase, and attitude. So, which of the following is, which of these above which I have just mentioned is the right hierarchical sequence? So, your answer is A. The right sequence is attention, comprehension, attitude, intention, and purchase. Coming to short answers. So, Howard and Sate classified the hypothetical constructs into 2 major groups. Mention them. So, the 2 major groups are the perceptual constructs and the learning constructs. You can basically classify the perceptual constructs into 4 subconstructs: search for information, stimulus ambiguity, attention, and perceptual bias. And then we have the second construct, which is the learning constructs, and you can classify the learning constructs into 7 sub learning constructs like motive, choice criteria, brand comprehension, attitude, intention, confidence, and satisfaction. So, these are the various constructs, hypothetical constructs which were actually proposed by Howard and Sate. Second question, mention the various components of Nicosia's model. So, the various components of Nicosia's model are marketers' communication affecting consumers' attitude, consumers' search and evaluation, purchase action, and consumption experience and feedback. So, we have these various subfields and subfields: marketers' communication affecting consumers' attitude, consumers' search and evaluation, the purchase action, the consumption experience, and the feedback. So, this could further be divided into 4 fields and 2 subfields. So, with this we come to a conclusion of session 3 of module 5. In the next session, we shall be doing 2 more models. We will be speaking about Bettman and we will be speaking about Engel, Collat, and Blackwell. So, I hope you have found this session fruitful, and we will continue in the next session. Thank you.